Okay, welcome back. It's me again, Professor Fleming. We've looked at the context for EcoCities, the drivers that are getting people to think about what a different kind of future would be. How could we transform cities to become centers for sustainability and ecological well-being? And so part of that process involves thinking holistically and thinking about a city from an integral perspective. Thinking about the upper right quadrant, for example, the financial investment, the systems in the lower right, the culture in the lower left, and finally the experience, the sense of wonder and beauty. And so if we think about the four quadrants, which I tend to like to do, as you know, we can think about a city that is carbon neutral, that is measurable and provable, a city that is resource neutral. And yeah, these seem far-fetched, but not really. There are people moving towards this. Obviously, economic investment is a key. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Underneath that, in the lower right, we have well-developed green infrastructure, critical to an ecological city. The buildings and interiors and spaces need to be net zero energy. We're moving towards that. And we need new financial systems that encourage investment, not just for profit, but also for the common good of the city itself to create an overall holistic, sustainable city. And in order to do that, then job training, job work opportunities, better educational systems are needed. If we have an eco-city where 80% of the population is in poverty, you're not going to make it. You're not going to have the overall quality of life that I think anybody would want. And finally, you need a sensory engagement city, a city of wonder, a city that is just so amazing that people want to come there and live there and spend their money there. That hasn't always been the case in many cities around the world. So an eco-city is a healthy human settlement model on the resilient structure of natural systems. And this is really critical. We're moving into a time with lots of climate change, with the world changing. So cities have to be able to respond to shock and respond to economic threats, respond to ecological threats. And so resilience is a strategy that we would use to do that. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. So what I worry about, though, when we think about an eco-city is the utopianism. And this is really the great flaw of architects especially, is to imagine this perfect society where everything is in balance. And the reality is that that's kind of what reality looks like in many cities around the world. And that is a sanitized version of what that means. Typically, this would mean getting rid of lots of people. And that ultimately really can't be considered sustainable, right? So cleansing is not really the answer. In other words, moving people out of cities that so-called don't belong or don't fit the mold or don't have the economic power to be involved in a sustainable city will ultimately lead to maybe an unsustainable city. So in 2011, we have a scenario where in some cities, at least, we have lots of trees, fresh air, access to water. And actually, I think this is even a utopian version of what reality might look like. And this is the other thing that we don't really want to think about or talk about or use is dystopian. And I think what happens with sustainability is we fall into a utopian or dystopian argument for what the future might be. And the truth, of course, lies in between. Sustainability becomes the vehicle to move between those two realities and find the stasis or find the level in which cities can function in a sustainable way. Now, Masdar City is one model, and again, all of these models that I'm going to show you have some utopianism in it. So I'm not presenting these as the perfect solution, but certainly they can inspire you in terms of thinking differently about how and what cities could be. And the Masdar City is under construction, actually, designed by Foster and Partners and many others, and was meant to be a carbon neutral city, which we talked about already. Now, I've got a great video for you that is posted in the in one of your modules that are right after this, but you can see that the lower right quadrant of understanding systems is really critical to laying the groundwork for what might be a sustainable city. So go ahead and watch that movie on Masdar City. This is another example in China, Dongtan, which has this idea that rather than looking at technology or infrastructure as the answer, look to ecology as the answer, to restoring ecological functioning, because that will create fresh air and also allow water to be purified. So this is sort of co-evolutionary model between humans and nature in order to do that. And yet still looking at the technology in homes and understanding that we got to get to net zero through that. And so open space becomes really critical, but also the integration of transportation, land, and technology. Here are a list of 6 considered some of the most sustainable eco-cities in the world. I'm going to talk about Copenhagen. Copenhagen is and probably will achieve carbon neutrality by 2035 without offsets. And I covered offsets in my last course. So what we want to do is find authentic carbon neutrality where the city itself is carbon neutral through its own power generation, its own energy efficiency reduction. And it's actually a pretty remarkable story. And amazingly, in such a cold climate, people are riding their bikes. And we talk about behavior change really as a critical aspect of how we're going to move towards a sustainable future. Riding our bikes in the freezing cold is part of what it's going to take to get to carbon neutrality. Now, you could say that from a quality of life, that's really bad, but from another level, the health implications of riding your bike are really amazing. And then also, of course, looking at public transportation and transforming that into a net zero energy transportation system is key. And then we have reinvesting in our housing stock and making sure that we can make these old buildings more efficient. That requires lots of jobs and lots of job training, which is actually pretty exciting when you think about what we want to do from a green jobs perspective. So it's a pretty exciting time, and there's a guy with a green job. He's not wearing a green shirt. But clearly, if we can leverage all of the work towards becoming an eco-city, we might actually have some impact on climate change. I personally think it's too late to impact the climate on the level that we'd like to do it with buildings. It's probably too slow. However, the idea of resilience and the idea that buildings can function under shock is really critical for that. So I'll talk about resilience in a little bit. Okay, in fact, I will do that in the next movie.